Hi guys, we're going to do a brief look at the scientific revolution. We don't need to know a ton of specifics about this movement, but I do want to add it to the mix of the movements happening in Europe throughout the Renaissance, into the 1600s and even into the 1700s, because what we're looking at is a culture of critique. That Europe in this Renaissance era is going back through all of its old information and beginning to question the powers that be. And all this is coming together to make Europe a superpower in this next phase of history. So we've seen people question the politics of the time via the Enlightenment. We've seen people question the church via the Protestant Reformation. So this is yet another movement that is questioning everything. So in scientific revolution, defined here, a transformation in European thought in the 1500s and 1600s that's called for scientific observation, experimentation, and questioning of traditional opinions. So before we get into the revolutionaries of this era, let's just remind ourselves of Europe's view of science beforehand and the limitations of science. One way in which science was limited in Europe was how much these European scientists were trying to keep to old Greek models. And as brilliant as the Greeks were, they were limited due to the time period they lived in, right? They didn't have the best equipment. And by not improving upon that thought over time and keeping to those old classics, you're inherently limited. Also, at some point, old Greek thinking begins to align with Christian thinking. And the best model for that is the model of geocentrism. Right? So this was the view of the universe, and the geocentric model, meaning the Earth is at the center of the solar system as we now know it, was something that Aristotle taught via his observations that were deemed obviously faulty later on. But this is something that the church continues, not because they teach it anywhere in the Bible, but because it aligns with a concept that, God created man, so why wouldn't he put man at the center of everything? Right? So this is what the church was teaching, and anything that challenged it was problematic. We also see via this diagram of Aristotle's universe that there is this emphasis on perfection. We have all these perfect circles. It's believed that all of the heavenly bodies, like the sun and the moon and everything, were absolutely perfect orbs, right? And of course, the Greeks thought of themselves and all of their creations as perfect. So it makes sense that they would push this belief, in their civilization, and it would be carried through other European civilizations. What's interesting is that as people begin to play with the geocentric model, specifically when the Pope in the Renaissance era begins to get scientists to try to nail down a more specific calendar. He wanted a better calendar so all Catholics would be celebrating every feast and holiday at the same time. All of these scientists kept coming back, essentially saying, like, the Earth is not at the center. But of course, the church didn't want to deal with that. One of the ways they tried to show that the Earth indeed was not at the center was showing how the planetary objects would have to move, how they would have to revolve around the Earth for that to be true. And it would be in these crazy retrograde loops. And this is how all the planetary bodies would have to be. So it meant that these bodies were whirling like crazy in the universe. And it just wasn't the simplest solution. Instead, of course, the sun being at the center was simplest. But the church didn't want to hear it. And that's kind of the theme of what we're looking at. If the church doesn't want to hear it, you might be deemed a heretic. And we know bad things happen to you if you are deemed a heretic. So while science might be moving forward, they couldn't publish anything that was really controversial. Other modes of scientific thinking before the scientific revolution, of course, include alchemy. Now, alchemy, if you'll remember, is early forms of chemistry. And while some of it is excellent science and is really the mother of chemistry, the ultimate goal of alchemy was to turn every substance into gold and to ultimately take all of those substances and make it into the philosopher's stone, which would give you supernatural powers. Right? So science and religion and superstition were all very linked before the scientific revolution. We have to remember that some people truly believed that witchcraft could answer some of the anomalies happening in the world, and that medicine, while some of it was good, was still very much based off of the Roman doctor Galen. And they didn't do a whole lot of dissections on the human body, so they were basing their information off of animals or some studies they did of the human body, though not complete ones. And so traditional medicines like bloodletting and the belief in the humors while sometimes might have worked, we're generally just very limited, right? So we've limited scientific thinking until things begin to change. So the first scientist I do want you to know is Copernicus. Copernicus is one of the scientists that is hired by the church to fix the calendar, but he is limited in his publishing he can do of the heliocentric theory, which is putting the sun at the center of our solar system, which simplified all things. So even though the calendar that he produces, promoted by the church, will be based on this model, it was still very limited, this publication of this model. So it was very hush, although well known in the scientific communities throughout Europe, and of course, as we know, something that was accepted by all other civilizations around the world. We'll note, though, that his model was still not correct, right? There's still a lot of perfect circles and whatnot, but at least we're moving a step in the correct direction. A couple of the scientists who helped to confirm heliocentrism and slowly work us towards our more modern view of our universe includes Tycho Brahe, shown here. Tycho Brahe he did a lot of work, but in terms of this stuff, he is best known for disputing the idea of planetary objects moving in perfect circles. Johann Kepler, is the scientist that is credited with discovering that the planetary objects move in elliptical paths, and then later on we learn that's due to gravity, that the sun, right, is kind of creating this gravitational pull that creates the unique orbital paths of all of our planetary objects. Very briefly, because I love this stuff, Tycho Brahe is one of my favorite figures in history, and that is very much due to his crazy biography. I don't know how well you can see, but if you can take a look at his face, he's an interesting looking man. There are many stories surrounding him, one of which was that he was very paranoid. He might have had some mental illness. He was also a big drinker. One of the stories is he would often challenge people to duels, but he was often drunk and said to be a very bad fighter, and that he lost his nose in one of the duels. He didn't want to walk around without a nose, so he had a nose fashioned for him. And if you can see, his nose is very kind of strange looking. That's because it was a false nose that he would, false metal nose that he put onto his face, that he would paint a flesh color that would often wash away in heavy rains. So, that's a cute look. One of my other favorite kind of stories of his is he had two quote-unquote pets, and I feel horrible saying that. One of which was a little person that he believed was clairvoyant, right, could tell his future and could tell if people were trying to kill him or poison him. So wherever he went, he brought this little person with him as his guide or as his kind of a fortune teller. He also domesticated an elk, and this elk of his he trained to relay messages to neighbors, and he loved the elk very much. It said that he had dinner with the elk and sometimes other guests every night. But tragically, one night, he had given the elk too much wine to drink, so the elk tumbled downstairs and died, and he fell into a deep depression after that. It's also said he held a beautiful funeral for the elk. I don't know, interesting guy. I'm looking forward to someone making a movie about his life. Anyway, back to science. Another key scientist I want you to know is Galileo Galilei. You should know him very well. He is most famous for perfecting the telescope, a technology that the Arabs had in the works. And as an Italian, we know Italians have always kept contact with the Turkish and Arab Middle East. He is said to have perfected the telescope and used that to observe the universe more. And he's discovering a lot of things that is confirming heliocentrism, but also pointing out the errors of the church. So we'll see sunspots on the sun and all these craters on the moon. And he does more work with the developments of motion, again, slowly leading us towards our understanding of gravity. Right? But he's really thinking beyond the physical constraints of the world, and he's really challenging the church. And that is why Galileo will be one of the targets of the Inquisition, the Italian Inquisition. He's famously brought in front of the Italian Inquisition and asked to recant his teachings, right, to take back all the scientific work. And when standing in front of the Italian Inquisition, he famously says, "With sincere heart and unprecedented faith, I abjure, curse, and detest the aforesaid heresies of Copernicus and also every other error contrary to the Holy Church. And I swear that in the future I will never again say or assert anything that might cause a similar suspicion towards me." So he recanted a lot. He took back everything. And some people can look at this as a true act of cowardice, right? How could you stand up and condemn all the work that you've ever done, right? So some people look at it as kind of a weak move. However, if you think about it, Pandora's box has already been opened, right? And what good does it do the scientific community, right, to have Galileo go to the gallows, right, to have him executed? Instead, he's on house arrest for the remainder of his life, but he's still able to do work in secret and to get his information out to the scientific community in secret. So you can look at it in one way as totally weak, not standing up for your work. However, many people saw it as a way that he could continue to work and contribute to European science. Another main person I want you to know is Francis Bacon. He is yet another person who has claimed to be the father of the scientific method. And you know the scientific method, right? You learn it every year in your science classes. But what's so important about the concept of the scientific method is it's really pushing the definition of European science to be observable science, that you must measure it, that you must have a theory, you must conduct experiments, you must reproduce the results of those experiments for it to be considered sound science. Before this, he criticized medieval thinkers of relying on even earlier thinkers, but nobody ever checked anybody else's work. So he's critiquing all past science as ultimately wrong, and thus everyone should go back and check the work, and if it doesn't hold up to the new standards of science, it must be scrapped. Right? So he's really pushing for empiricism, right? Observable science. On the other hand, we have thinkers like Rene Descartes, who is not only a scientist but a philosopher, and he's one of our rationalists. He's most famous for saying "cogito ergo sum," I think, therefore I am, which is a true simplification of that concept. But his whole idea is that the power of thinking, the power of the brain, the power of reason can sometimes serve to be a really powerful tool of knowing and understanding. Specifically, he and some others believed that there's only so much that you can observe, right? That there are things beyond our perceptions, especially until you can get the technologies to better understand the world around us. So you should take the observable world as a starting point, but use your powers of reason to fill in the blanks, right? By linking measurable things like geometry with somewhat less measurable concepts like algebra, we get the foundations for calculus via Rene Descartes and some other scientists who all claim to be the fathers of calculus. But simply kind of putting out there this idea and blending these beliefs that, we can measure some stuff, but not everything, right? And that's the power of the human mind, is to fill in the gaps that the eyes, the ears cannot see and hear. Isaac Newton, we also need to know, super fascinating man, right? These are his, bigger contributions to the scientific community, right? Obviously one of the many people, but always given the credit for kind of discovering and really hammering down the concept of gravity. The three laws of motion, which you should have studied in science class. He does a great deal with optics and a lot more. But what I find so fascinating about Isaac Newton is he is a true man of the times. By this I mean he was a man of empirical science, but he was also a man of religion. It's believed that during his time in university, both as a student and as a professor, that he spent more time studying and writing about Christianity and his faith than he did science. And considering how much he's contributed to science, I can imagine how much he was devoting to religion. And some of it was controversial, right? He definitely had an issue with the concept of the Holy Trinity of Christianity, right? How can you preach monotheism but say God has three parts, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit? And what he studied doesn't matter so much as this idea that our men of science were also men of religion. That in the world we live in today, science, religion often seems so far away, so far apart. Sometimes there's these beliefs that, if you're a person of science, you must automatically be an atheist and only believe in science. How can you possibly believe in a God? But that was not the case in this era, and Isaac Newton is our best example to highlight this. Our last example I want to give you is Andrea Vesalius, mostly because I think he's super fascinating. I really like him. He was a Flemish anatomist. And I also want you to note here in this one image of him that many people do believe he might have been of mixed race, possibly of some African ancestry. And that, of course, especially in this era, this is really pre-heightened racism that had no effect on his status. in Flemish society. And he's not the first person to dissect the human body, right? Da Vinci was definitely doing it, and I'm sure scientists in the medieval era were also doing it quietly. But what's interesting about his book on the workings of the human anatomy is that he makes some of the most illustrated manuals of human dissection to really bring the human body to life, and he popularizes human dissection to a high degree to push more people to study the human body. So he worked with various artists to document his dissections. It looks a lot like the Body Worlds exhibits that travel around the United States, looking at bodies stripped down to our various states. So here we can see one of his subjects. Sometimes he was able to get bodies via donations. Sometimes they would be prisoners. There's a lot of donation sources. At some point, people are just 100% devoting their bodies to his study because he was such a popular anatomist. But we can see here, he wasn't simply interested in a body laying flat on a table and opening up and seeing what's inside. He's one of the first to say, the body is in motion in life. Right? So what does the body look like? What do the muscles and the veins look like when a person stands, when they lift their arm? Also, a couple key details, like how he would often leave the hair on top of the illustration of the subject to remind you of the humanity of a person was a goal of his. All right, so what does the body look like standing? Also, what's inside the head? He's one of the first to publish images, right, these sketches of the human brain. As much as other doctors would have been opening up, like the torso, people stayed away from the head. That was seen as very taboo, but he was first to open it. And again, if you'll note, keeping images of the face, a reminder of the humanity of the subjects that he used. This is another image, right? What happens when a person is bending? What happens when a person squats? What does a male pelvis look like, seen in this subject, versus a female pelvis, right, that's had many children, right? Let's compare these things. He was known sometimes to open up a body, check the organs, then sew it back up, and then throw the body down a flight of stairs to see the impact of a big fall like that. So he really experimented with the body, and much was learned from his work and inspired a lot of other people. This is a sketch of one of his public dissections, which I think this image is really interesting and kind of hilarious at certain points. But what he did is he made it more acceptable to the public. So at first it would be other doctors, and then eventually nobles wanted to watch this as like a form of entertainment, and then other members of the public would come and watch these dissections. It's kind of difficult to see, but there's some people who are just praying because they believe that he was doing a horrible, sinful thing. Other people are very interested from, intellectual standpoints or whatnot. It also just seemed like a crazy party. Like, who let this monkey in here? There's like a dog. I guess it's a dog or a goat. I'm not sure exactly what that is. So it's a little wild. I don't know what this guy's doing in the corner. But as you can see, it ends up being almost like a social event, right? So attitudes are changing towards science, and we have this culture of questioning, and all this is leading towards a more interesting, more critical, and more contributing European community. All right, so that's it for now. Okay, thanks.